The palace doors were never the real entrance. The ocean was. Let that sink in for a second. Because this is the part of the story nobody ever analyzed properly. Everyone focused on royal weddings, tiaras, exit interviews, and Netflix confessionals. Nobody asked, where did the network begin? Who witnessed the early shaping? Who saw the draft version of the Duchess before the world knew her by title? And the most ironic twist of all, the woman finally opening this chapter today isn't a journalist, a Hollywood rival, a Soho House whistleblower, or a royal biographer. It's Sarah Ferguson, Duchess of York, the ultimate insider, outsider of royal history. The woman who knows reinvention. The woman who understands how legends are built, burned, survived, and rewritten in the margins. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. So I'll start with this. What if your most defining era was one you never intended the public to decode? Because that's the first rule of elite ecosystems. They aren't secret because they are shameful. They are secret because they are strategic. Power doesn't scatter receipts. Influence doesn't leave minutes. Ambition signs NDAs of a different kind, the unspoken ones. But yachts? Yachts are different. Yachts are symbolism and physics colliding. Yachts float, but they also anchor narratives. They're glamorous, but they also imprison origin stories. They don't just move people across water. They move people across eras of identity. And within the meteoric trajectory of Meghan Markle, there exists one gravitational constant. Long before Frogmore Cottage, Montecito, or the Invictus Stadium lights, there was exclusivity at sea, alliances on decks, reputations negotiated in waves, and media mythology waiting to be born. But first, you need to understand Soho House itself. Not the Instagram filter version, the sociology of it, the psychology, the structure. Because this institution isn't a club, it's a sorting algorithm for the socially powerful. It has an interior design, but it also has a political architecture. It doesn't just grant entry. It scouts trajectories. Soho House is where anonymity meets hierarchy, where celebrities go to feel unseen, but also evaluated, where influence isn't measured in followers, but proximity. You don't join because you're famous. You join because someone powerful decided you might become more useful than famous. Here's a question for you. How does someone go from being discussed in private rooms to being debated in parliaments? It starts when gatekeepers bet on potential instead of credentials. Meghan wasn't unique for being on yachts. She was unique for being observed while on them. Soho House yacht culture wasn't a vacation. It was a curriculum. While red carpets reward fame, private decks certify access. In Hollywood, you audition for roles. In elite social networks, you audition for circles. A film set tests your acting range. A yacht tests your alliance range. One exposes talent. The other exposes adaptability. And this is the era Sarah Ferguson claims history misunderstood entirely. Not because it was darker than portrayed, but because it was smarter than credited. Because here's the contradiction. Meghan's public brand has always been about progressive advocacy, emotional transparency, and humanitarian relatability. Yet the gateway that elevated her earliest visibility was hyper-private, hyper-curated, and socially transactional. The opposite of open book. The opposite of transparency. A universe where nothing is posted, but everything is logged socially. Does that mean hypocrisy? No. It means translation. Meghan learned how to convert exclusivity into relatability, silence into storytelling, social alliances into institutional leverage, private networks into public influence. That is not a scandal. That is a strategy masterclass. But masterclasses always have witnesses you never intended to lecture. And Sarah Ferguson says she was one of them. Let's pause here for an emotional beat. Sarah Ferguson once carried her own nickname storms, tabloid caricatures, exile arcs, credibility assassinations, and media resurrections. She knows what it feels like when the public narrates you wrong, but believes themselves correct. She survived the royal ecosystem by accepting its contradictions and ironically mastering reinvention faster than the system mastered controlling her narrative. So when Sarah speaks, it hits differently. It's not gossip. It's pattern recognition. Someone once told her silence was safer. But redemption is louder when unexpected. Which brings us to the deeper layer of today's relevance. Why do audiences care so obsessively about the pre-Duchess era of Meghan Markle now? Because reinvention won. Think about it. The monarchy is one of the oldest brand institutions in the world. Tiara IP, title licensing, imagery contracts, hard power aesthetics, soft power myth-making. The Windsor family didn't need Hollywood lessons. They taught them for centuries. Yet in the only era where a Duchess narrative escaped royal containment and spread globally faster than palace response cycles, the world watched someone deploy Hollywood sociology on a royal system that thought it had already copyrighted mystique. But here's the twist. The monarchy didn't lose a public figure. It lost an interpreter of its social coding. And interpretations change civilizations faster than rules do. This video isn't about a yacht era. It's about the origin of narrative control. Meghan Markle's story matters now because it arrived at the intersection of three public obsessions. Royal protocol, oldest form of brand hierarchy. Hollywood ecosystems, most industrial form of influence hierarchy. Tabloid mythology, fastest form of narrative distribution. And yachts were where those hierarchies touched. But before you accuse me of romanticizing the metaphor, let's lay another contradiction on the table. The public thinks reinvention is emotional liberation. Elite ecosystems think reinvention is strategic mobility. On decks, both definitions observed each other. Which brings us to the most powerful piece of the curiosity gap we're opening today. Was Meghan the subject of yacht gossip inside elite circles, or the student of social politics inside them? Sarah Ferguson says the world assumed the first and never examined the second. The implication isn't morality. It's authorship. So, this phase begins not with accusation, but sociology. Question for you. Is a woman who climbs visibility through elite networks less authentic for later advocating for the unheard, or brilliant for using the powerful to spotlight the marginalized later? Keep that question warm. We'll return to it when the payoff hits. Now let's paint the setting, because retention needs scenery, rhythm, and momentum. Imagine a multi-million-pound yacht quietly rocking in an ocean divide between industries and institutions. Champagne and strategy coexisting. Architects of reputation trading influence like diplomats. Assistants carrying social capital instead of policy memos. Wi-Fi weak, but alliances strong. Sunsets gilding introductions richer than any theater spotlight. The air smelling of networking gravity instead of ocean salt. This was the arena where branding stopped being theoretical and became title. And it was pre-social media viral, which means the power wasn't posted. It was inherited socially. Soho doesn't take applications, insiders joke. Soho takes trajectories. But nobody joked harder than the universe when a future British Duchess was being evaluated from a deck long before London title drops. And Sarah Ferguson says evaluations happened. But the public never analyzed the grading rubric. Network ecosystems predate public identity. The monarchy is institutional power. Hollywood is industrial power. Soho House is social power. The public assumes these realms don't mix unless scandal forces them together. But the elites know they mix constantly, just quietly. The guest lists are the treaties. The decks are the negotiations. The alliances are the currencies. What people call yacht days was never defined by geography. It was defined by access pathways. And Sarah says pathways were observed, documented socially, and mythologized later by media that never met the gatekeepers who graded the era. When media doesn't access a network directly, it invents one narratively faster than influence circles defend themselves publicly. This era matters emotionally because the contradiction fascinates us. Meghan's brand would later become synonymous with breaking elitist ceilings, championing unheard narratives, defying institutional scripts, and democratizing royal mystique via public intimacy storytelling. Yet the launchpad for her earliest visibility was a hyper-private influence curriculum at sea, inside the very ecosystems she would later publicly contrast herself against. She didn't escape the rules. She learned to translate them. Yachts were classrooms. Connections were thesis statements. Guest lists were exams. Silence was a diploma. The ocean just provided the stage for the social syllabus. Sarah Ferguson says the biggest secret of this era isn't about who attended. It's about what Meghan learned to carry away unstated. Sarah Ferguson has lived the arc the media miswrote once. She knows the cost of narrative assumption. She knows what elite culture documents socially without memos. She understands the implied hierarchy of circles that never publish minutes. She survived royal exile by mastering reinvention socially instead of fighting it institutionally. She knows that when media invents your draft version, only a witness can publish the social rubric properly later. She said she'd never speak. But that was before the world asked the ocean the right question. And as the final seconds of this introduction rock in, I'll leave you with the line this entire script hinges on. The world thinks the yacht era was where a Duchess reputation began. But Sarah says it was where a palace narrative lost its chance to own authorship before Hollywood proximity even noticed it was an audition. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The world talks about the British crown like it's the ultimate power structure. But what if I told you there are smaller kingdoms operating under velvet ropes that influence the influencers before any royal seal is stamped? Sounds dramatic, doesn't it? But that's exactly why Sarah Ferguson says this chapter actually starts. Not with a monarch. With a membership card that opens doors even the monarchy has to tiptoe around. So here's your mini hook. If Soho House were a chessboard, Meghan Markle was never a pawn. She was a piece the players started betting on without announcing the game had begun. Let's break this open. Soho House was founded on a different kind of hierarchy. The kind that doesn't need a coronation because the crown is implied. No trumpets, no banners, just invitation lists, murmured reputations, and a silent system of valuation that operates more like currency exchange than social convergence. You can't understand the rise of any high-profile figure that passed through this network without understanding what Soho House is and what it isn't. It isn't a public social club. It is a private power ecosystem, an elected aristocracy of cultural capital. But before you roll your eyes at the metaphor, let's ground it in psychology. In traditional aristocracy, your influence is inherited by bloodline. In celebrity aristocracy, influence is inherited by visibility. In Soho aristocracy, influence is inherited by proximity. That's the key. Proximity. This is why every actor, producer, influencer, and rising public figure wants in, even when they pretend not to care. It's the club you make jokes about, until they stop laughing back. Soho House doesn't announce relevance, it predicts it. And some predictions have NDAs. Now, let's hit a media contradiction. Right now in the public sphere, Meghan Markle is often framed as a disruptor of elitism. She speaks for the unheard. She champions openness. She produces content built on vulnerability, testimonials, advocacy, and breaking ceilings. That's the brand today. Yet the origin of her highest visibility interest didn't happen through open dialogue. It happened through the quiet calculus of exclusivity, a system that elevated her because it saw a conversion opportunity. The ability to translate social capital into broader relevance later. The irony? The very systems she would later define herself as contrasting publicly were the first ecosystems that began privately elevating her reputation potential long before the palace stamp. So ask yourself this. Is it strange that a modern disruptor rose through an old ecosystem that values silence over press conferences, connections over proclamations, introductions over interviews? Or is it brilliant that she learned to master influence without shouting for it? Let's go deeper. Soho House culture operates on layered networks. Layer 1. The people the public knows are inside. Layer 2. The people insiders know are inside but don't boast. Layer 3. The people being evaluated for future inside. The public speculates about the first layer endlessly. The commentary focuses on celebrities eating lunch, sipping drinks, taking photos nobody ever posts later. That's the mythology. But the internal mechanics? Those live at layers 2 and 3. And Sarah Ferguson says layer 3 was where Meghan first entered the story long before any UK or Hollywood press debated the narrative. So let's paint the invisible architecture. Imagine rooms lit like minimalist confessionals. Sofas softer than reputations. Conversations quieter than branding wars. Notebooks closed unless someone powerful signs the page mentally without writing a memo. The energy of potential buzzing through introductions nobody posts on LinkedIn. You can look right at a thing and never see it properly if you don't understand the valuation system. Which brings us to an uncomfortable emotional beat Sarah says nobody decoded publicly. In elite circles, being discussed isn't embarrassing. Being excluded is. Being rumored about at sea isn't a scandal. It's a signal. Soho House turned red carpets into waiting rooms, yacht decks into social referendums, friendships into leverage bridges, cocktail chatter into reputational futures contracts. Does that mean manipulation or magnetism with awareness? You tell me. But before you answer that, let's put the audience in the uncomfortable seat. How many introductions do you think change someone's career versus the ones that change someone's narrative trajectory before any journalist reads the press release? How many private hellos rewrite a person's public gravity later without posting a single photo? Soho House is where celebrity relevance is minted socially before it's minted publicly. That's why producers, directors, agents, and high-profile celebrities treat it like oxygen. It's not about fame. It's about being validated silently as someone worth more than momentary buzz. It's the club that acts like a human refinery for cultural futures. And Fergie says the refinery was testing one person harder than the public realized. Now let's talk symbolism for a second, because retention likes imagery spikes. A palace crown weighs 4 pounds physically, but infinite pounds symbolically. Soho House wears a different crown, lighter in mass, heavier in exchange value. It weighs nothing, but converts stories into institutions, titles into archetypes, archetypes into audiences, audiences into influence. This place rules people who rule the screens that rule people. See the nesting dolls now? The monarchy is one of the oldest institutions in the world. But the influence ecosystem behind Soho House moves faster than institutional messaging and almost always understands the scripts better than the writers who think they own authorship. Plot twist. The most powerful institutions often lose the narrative first at sea. Now let's do a quick emotional pacing shift. You might think a yacht is the ultimate freedom. Floating, drifting, luxurious, untethered. A girl leaning against the rail while ocean spray decorates a draft identity before any palace PR team even scans the briefing document later. But Sarah Ferguson says yachts don't float narratives freely. They test them. They introduce you to circles that elevate you silently before kingdoms call you by title. They are floating parliaments of potential leverage, reputation risk negotiation, brand elasticity evaluation, and social politics auditions. Meghan wasn't unique for being on yachts. She was unique for being graded socially while on them. Soho House yacht culture was never about the ocean. It was about the voting rooms that floated above it. Now let's talk about that phrase that keeps popping up in the public imagination. Yacht days. That phrase became viral later because the public loves glamour with a question mark. Glamour is accessible fantasy. A question mark is narrative ownership anyone can claim. The problem with narrative ownership built on speculation is the ones who hold the actual syllabus stay silent, while media composers score symphonies of rumor without sheet music. Sarah Ferguson says she'll finally show you the sheet music. But she begins not by confirming every public speculation about why yachts mattered. She begins by explaining why Soho mattered first. Soho House seated people who seat people who influence the people you watch on award shows. It is club aristocracy without a castle. Doesn't need one. The interior design is the moat. Membership is the drawbridge. Introductions are the knights. And the public never saw the early versions of the introductions happening on decks because the ocean conceals where ladders are built better than anywhere else on Earth. Now let's hit a narrative physics analogy to make the emotional rises land. A boat floats on water because buoyant force pushes it up equal to the weight of the water displaced. Influence floats on cultural capital because social force pushes it up equal to the future capital it may displace later in public institutions if predictions are correct. Soho House predicted Meghan right. The media narrated Meghan loudly. The palace responded years too late to contain the draft era as anything other than rumor mythology. And rumor mythology spreads faster than institutional correction cycles. Why does this matter emotionally to audiences now? Because Meghan Markle's trajectory wasn't ordinary. It was translational. She took the language of elite silence and translated it into advocacy megaphones later. She took the currency of exclusivity circles and reprinted it as relatability monologues later. She took a deck era that tabloids eventually attempted to narrate as scandal and reframed her post-royal era as public intimacy narrative control. But the launchpad was never noise. It was prediction by silent proximity. And Fergie says she saw the predictions happening. Which leads us to the next audience sting. How do you know it was evaluation and not rumor culture? Sarah said she lived rumor culture herself. This is how she recognized the difference. Now let's move into the mechanical psychology of retention, because this is a 1-hour script prediction universe. Soho House values alignment without announcements. The alliances are unspoken until profitable publicly later. This is why when the media finally excavated the word yacht days, it hit like a curiosity storm without forensic proof because the moats are social, not factual. The public assumed yachts carried scandal cargo. Insiders joked that yachts carried trajectory cargo. Trajectory cargo sometimes becomes influence monarchy later. The public believes the ones who shout the narrative. The elites know the ones who stay silent often wrote it first. And the irony? Sarah Ferguson says the silence was contractual long before the public narrative was theatrical. Now let's ignite tension again with a few more psychological prisms. Social power doesn't boast, it brokers. Celebrity influence isn't inherited, it's negotiated. Protocol doesn't recruit actors, it evaluates characters. Reputation isn't defended by press releases, it's defended by proximity leverage, legal architecture, or total silence. The most expensive amenity on a yacht is never posted. It is the unspoken alliances you can sell socially later without displacing legal liability publicly. One more question for you, audience. How many conversations have you had on sofas that changed your life without anyone else ever getting a transcript? Soho knows this answer inherently, which means the chapter was never the scandal. The chapter was the audition. Now slow the pacing for the closing moment before we ignite the exit cliffhanger. Meghan Markle's Soho House era represents a different and more defensible story if you drop the language of scandal and adopt the language of hierarchy translation. She entered a system that grades influence silently. She climbed spaces where cultural capital is minted by proximity. She built friendships nested 3 layers deeper than public interviews could authorize reputationally later. She reinvented identity by translating elite silence into public narrative authority later before the monarchy determined how to publicly score the press release. Sarah Ferguson says the ocean never forgets the footprints. But the question you never asked is who was making the introductions before the wind changed direction narratively years later. The birth of a nickname the public never heard. Minnie Hook. How do you crown someone before the world even knows a coronation was staged? Because that's the real question here. You think nicknames are accidental. In elite circles, they're branding prototypes. Unofficial title drafts. Test balloons sent into influence wind tunnels long before the press ever prints a headline. And Sarah Ferguson is adamant about this. The phrase Duchess of Yacht didn't emerge from tabloids first. It emerged from a world that views luxury as language, access as resume, and silence as wiring. You know what the press never got? They treated the nickname like punchline gossip, but insiders treated it like a forecast. So let's rewind. Not for nostalgia, but for understanding. Soho House didn't just curate rooms, it curated tears. Yachts weren't parties. They were floating index funds of influence. And status within that ecosystem didn't come from loud proclamations or televised interviews. It came from being co-signed socially by the network's gravitational pull, which is why the nickname stuck. Not because Meghan demanded visibility on decks, but because she earned memorability in a system that rarely gives last names, let alone laurels. Think about that paradox. A woman later framed as a royal disruptor had one of her earliest brand prototypes minted by a system older in hierarchy thinking than Hollywood or Windsor playbooks. The nickname wasn't a crown. It was a navigation coordinate. And coordinates lead somewhere. But why a title like that? Why the sea? Why yachts? Here's your first real answer. Yachts are influence metaphors that can't be pinned to a press conference. They're liminal spaces. Not quite land. Not fully international waters legally speaking, yet absolutely their own jurisdiction socially. Yachts are geography's loophole for reputations. They operate like private embassies, where introductions are treaties, jokes are mood boards, and perceptions are quietly passed around like velvet-backed invoices. So ask yourself, have you ever been evaluated where there's no official paperwork, but everything is registered mentally by the people who are the paperwork? That is the mechanics of Layer 2 of Soho aristocracy. Now, let's map the hierarchy of the name Duchess of Yacht specifically. This wasn't a nickname that referenced an official role. It was a nickname that referenced a social internship in a power economy that operates more quietly than a palace briefing. The yacht culture inside Soho isn't about the ocean. It's about the canopy above it. The sundeck socials that act like elevator pitch rooms without cameras. Where potential is measured by one quality most biographies never test explicitly: narrative elasticity. This is a place where reputations don't crack, they bend. They're tested against waves of desirability by circles of social exchange, long before any constitutional monarchy or Hollywood constituency reads the PDF. So, back to the name. Duchess, because the system demands metaphorical hierarchy. Yacht, because the system demands metaphorical stage. Meghan was crowned the prototype Duchess on decks because insiders saw brand potential bending through circle proximity more fluidly than job titles or red carpets could physically anchor publicly. But how did it feel? Let's turn the pacing now, because we're not just writing an outline. We're reliving evaluative atmosphere. Picture it: Tuscan leather seats, minimalist but potent interiors, conversations that smoked cigars of speculation without inhaling responsibility's press cycle. Assistants carrying more reputational weight than politicians carry official paper trails. A woman leaning over a rail while industry orbit moves around her silently, like gravitational math. Guests polite, but evaluative. Champagne clinking like analytics dashboards nobody ever prints later. Sunset flattering intros, casting long shadows of potential antique tables where every joke is a A/B test. You're going to call her what? A producer laughed once. But nobody laughed twice. And laughter inside elite circles isn't dismissal. It is data gathering. The question for audiences now: how do you know when a nickname in elite culture means danger, potential, or dismissal? It means whichever outcome displaces the most narrative weight later with no official transcript available. And the elites rarely name wrong, even when they joke first. Sarah Ferguson recognized this as a survivor of her own media anthropology funerals in prior decades. She knows what a system looks like when it's testing a reputation prototype silently. So while media archaeologists in future years would later assign the nickname era as gossip territory, Sarah understands the difference between room rumor and circle grading. So let's hit this psychological beat directly. Circle grading happens silently and sticks harder than rumor chatter ever decodes protagonistically. The second tier of this dynamic, the guest lists. It's 2016 to 2018. Imagine real names circulating like IPO prospectus drafts. These yacht events weren't tabloid-attended stories, but they were Hollywood-attended circles. A constellation of entertainment's silent plurality. Producers, influencers, directors, actors, media power brokers. Celebrity connectors, Sarah says, sometimes tower above palace correspondence channels in narrative exchange value. These lists weren't printed. They were whispered reputationally, like atmospheric physics that can't be FOIA requested later. And in that whisper ecosystem, the nickname stuck with the people that matter because insiders saw a piece that could later convert the translation of elite silence into public monarchy debates before Windsor PR teams evaluated it properly. That's the calculus. Silent co-signing beats written memos socially. Now let's hit satire, because retention needs emotional variety. Hollywood loves irony, and royals love titles. Soho House loves a blend of both, but weaponized socially without swords. The public thinks titles come from lineage or marital seal. Insiders think titles come from various currencies: talent, proximity, context, potential displacement value. So here's another rhetorical for you. If a nickname is royalty inside an elite network, does that mean someone is problematic? Or that someone is being prepared silently for institutional debate years before any monarchy or Hollywood union assigns meaning officially? Because that's the pivot. The media eventually turned yacht days into rumor folklore. Sarah says rumor folklore is what happens when journalists know the stage, but not the scoring rubric. And this is where emotional paradox enters. Meghan's public brand later would be authenticity, openness, advocacy, emotional resonance, modern narrative correction, progressive humanitarian monologues. Yet her earliest visibility reputation era was minted by a system that values exclusivity, private circles, introductions that are co-signed, not interviewed. Forecasting potential, not rewarding fame. Silence, not press releases. Does that mean hypocrisy? No. It means linguistic strategy in hierarchy economies. Meghan learned 2 languages of influence at once. Language 1, the silent proximity economy. Language 2, the outgoing public intimacy economy. Yachts were not the story. They were the Rosetta Stone between both systems. And Sarah Ferguson says Rosetta Stones always have authors you didn't know were scribes. Now let's deepen the emotional beats. Meghan was being shaped by circles that didn't want cameras. The public never saw it, but insiders felt it. This is a place where the absence of footage becomes presence's most contagious rumor fuel later. Yachts are stages where glamour looks like freedom, while evaluation feels like polite observation without applause. But they spot pieces that can carry narrative potential farther than confidentiality's moats can contain. Sarah says the public never decoded this because they treated the nickname like gossip caricature. But Meghan treated it like access scholarship, and Soho House treated it like trajectory forecast. That forecast would later matter most when palace narrative evaluation responded too late. One more audience question. Have you ever studied the curriculum of influence you didn't know you were being taught until someone whispers it later in an interview, season you never thought they would survive to speak through? Exactly. Sarah Ferguson survived to speak through it. Now let's ignite the second half of the build-up into the how did this nickname broker mood AIB valuation prototypes emotionally connect with future institutional narratives? It begins here. Meghan didn't just attend yachts. She networked and turned on them in a private embassy of social capital. The nickname referred to social co-signing, not official position. And the reason it stuck wasn't because she asked for it to stick. It was because the circles with gravitational influence inside Soho House said it might matter later, even silently. But what circles applaud silently matters more than what tabloids assume loudly. Which leads us to the next gravitational puzzle, the big guest. The introduction no one ever posted. The name that turned polite observation into narrative stakes tension, Sarah says, changed everything. Because remember where Chapter 1 ended? The unspoken implication that introductions were happening silently and valuations were real. And here's your pattern twist to end this phase specifically. The nickname stuck. The circles co-signed her narrative elasticity silently. The public never graded the era properly. But the moment that stamped future institutional relevance was still waiting politely on a guest list that looked like a joke until the universe realized it was analytics. But what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. Ever wonder why some moments get photographed and others get weaponized without a single picture? Because the story you think you know is always the one the cameras agreed to publish. But the story the influence circles remember? That one doesn't need evidence, because its currency is memory and access. And according to Sarah Ferguson, the biggest misunderstanding of Meghan Markle's yacht era isn't what the public imagined happened on those decks. It's how deliberately visibility itself was being rehearsed. Most people chase the spotlight. This world trains you to borrow it. And a yacht isn't where you test your acting. It's where you test your social range before your performance range gets purchased publicly later. So let's blow the doors open wider and walk onto the deck together. Picture the ocean stretched like a liquid film set. The sun acting as key light, not interviewer. The waves rhythmically pacing the monologue introductions that may later be printed by journalists who never got invited to the rehearsal. There's a silence on these decks that feels glamorous until you realize it's not absence, it's negotiation. A place where first impressions are market researched by people too famous to publish the minutes, and too influential to ever show up on a call sheet publicly. Imagine teak under high heels. Not red carpet. Teak. Imagine wins determining reputational lift. Not headlines. Imagine introductions happening above ocean weight lines calibrated to audience curiosity demographics that won't get paid off until Windsor or Hollywood respond too late. This place was never a party submarine. It was a visibility wind tunnel audition room for your future narrative authorship. Now, let's put emotional stakes on this, because I want you leaning forward. Meghan Markle, pre-Duchess, was a working actress known for her role in Suits, but the industry knew the real audition rooms for broader relevance were no longer soundstages or casting directors. Hollywood's ecosystem shifted. Influence is not just measured by what you do on camera. It's measured by what circles you can enter without the camera being present at the table while they grade your brand elasticity silently. And Meghan passed through the hardest grading room without applause first. Why does this matter to audiences psychologically now? Because the public imagination always asks the same questions. How did a global narrative cluster form around one person without official confirmations early? Why do yachts keep showing up in early folklore conversation about identity prototypes? Why would a Duchess title echo metaphorically where the monarchy never published a memo? Sarah says it's because those decks tested narrative mobility before any institutional messaging latched onto the story. Meghan's yacht era signaled an understanding of visibility translation, not visibility desperation. But here's the paradox twist nobody discusses in mainstream biographies. Public Meghan Markle equals openness, advocacy, emotional transparency, humanitarian messaging, algorithmic relatability. Early Meghan Markle being socially evaluated inside Soho House's yachting circles equals quiet brand adaptability, VIP introductions, political elasticity, celebrity adjacency evaluation without footage. So here's a direct question for you, audience. Is it uncomfortable when your public brand origin story began privately being graded by circles that value silence more than speeches? Or is it genius that you learned how to carry social logs, mental co-signings into narrative authority later before institutions responded with a press strategy? What if the silent era was the training montage, not the scandal? Because that's exactly what Sarah Ferguson says we need to decode properly. Let's talk Hollywood geography and influence anthropology for a second. Hollywood and royalty are myth industries, but Soho House is a bridge industry. A world where introductions are diplomatic handshakes, not red carpet waves. Where the absence of evidence is exactly why stories lift faster than corrections can contain. Folks laugh when they're uncomfortable publicly, but insiders leak gravity logs inside circles that can't be subpoenaed socially for tone. Which brings us to the second half, the art of curated intro vitamomics without documentation early. On decks, storytelling prototypes are tested in real time without transcripts. You begin to understand how to trade quiet power ecosystems for louder narrative futures later. So let's narrate how visibility works at Soho in 3 acts. The audition wasn't acting. It was access adaptability. Mini-hook open inside act. Meghan didn't audition for attention. She auditioned for network positioning where the world never reported she was being assessed yet. Here's the build-up inside Act 1. Meghan knew the role that would eventually earn her institutional relevance would have nothing to do with scripted characters. It would have everything to do with social brokering without cameras in evaluation economies. She expanded her social range quietly. She mastered intros embroidered with political adjacency analogies like Hollywood cameo feature roles with uncredited cast. She worked within a system that doesn't reward loudness. She rewarded its forecast of potential by making sure she could bend reputationally to circles without cracking publicly until payoff moments can be narratively weaponized later with emotional dividends. This is how icons get tested quietly, not by newspapers, but by circles that read narrative elasticity before it's printed. And of course, there was humor nested in it. Soho House isn't a club, insiders say. It's a soft power refinery with a velvet rope and a casting couch that doesn't hand out trophies unless it sees leverage mobility for your future narrative prospects. And on that casting couch of implied adjacency, Meghan's visibility broadened silently. Not shamefully, strategically. But every scholarship comes with an exam the public never gets a transcript for until someone survives long enough to talk about we knew her first sociology later. Visibility is borrowed, not possessed. You don't rise because you shine. You rise because someone powerful lets you borrow shine without owning the liability sheet. Let's hit the emotional spikes of Act 2. Soho House culture brokers visibility instead of awarding it. It is not about being seen. It is about being seeable by the gatekeepers who decide your narrative mobility later. The monarchy publishes imagery. Hollywood pays photographers. Soho House pays connectors without invoices and uses silence as legal amenity. It is a place that trains you to accept visibility loans, quiet introductions, before mainstream industries generate folklore cargo questions later with narrative ROI. Meghan's 2016 to 2018 era yacht adjacency story matters not because it's scandalous. It's curated visibility negotiation in elite networks. She understood the ledger early. You borrow the spotlight, you never demand it. Demanding spotlight gets you memory hold. Borrowing spotlight gets you remembered as someone who could matter later when monarchy or Hollywood responds with PR teams that discovered too late you were being test-floated socially. Now another direct question. Have you ever been evaluated by the people who are the evaluation sheets, without a transcript? How many private embassies have you navigated where visibility itself is graded silently, like unphotographed casting call tiers long before the tabloids try to take ownership of your origin story description? Exactly. And the biggest grading criteria wasn't fame. It was narrative elasticity tested against circles that could later shape public mythology without footage early. The origin of narrative ownership. So who owned the narrative first? The yachts didn't. The circles above them did. Meghan was not unique for attending yachts. She was unique for understanding how reputational prototypes are valued socially without memos first, then narrated like viral archaeology by a media constituency that never got the grading rubric early. But the most profitable visibility loan is the one you never publish a ledger for until a witness speaks. And Sarah Ferguson says she held the ledger mentally longer than any monarchy or Hollywood contract ever penned publicly first. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. If a room could sink, this one would float instead. Let me take you back onto the water, not for the glamour shot, but for the social blueprint etched underneath it. Because here's the truth about VIP ecosystems that nobody ever explains with enough honesty. The people who matter most don't gather in rooms. They gather above the detail lines, where reputations get silently polled, alliances get stress-tested, and mythology incubates in a contained vacuum years before the contained vacuum becomes kingdom-wide narrative wildfire. Now imagine the camera angle pulling back an inch, just enough to see the invisible scaffolding. This era was a carnival of adjacency wrapped in diplomatic ambience, not diplomacy in a policy sense. Diplomacy in a social authority calibration sense. The rules of Hollywood, monarchy, media, and influence circles all occupied the same jurisdiction without signing border agreements publicly. And the jurisdiction, in this case, was teak decks, curated guest rotations, power introductions brokered via connectors more valuable than any palace press team or Hollywood call sheet, and a system of reputation value exchange that operated like underground railroads of visibility decades older than social media ever made a headline out of. Soho House yacht culture wasn't opulent because it was luxurious. It was opulent because it was small. The smaller the circle, the heavier the crown. Not the Windsor crown, the influence crown the public never got a photo assignment for. So ask yourself this, audience, how many friend enemies do you think formed introductions on decks disguised as travel influencers until some graduate silently, with narrative elasticity credits brokered long before the tabloids try excavating origin stories without the rubric or evidence chain? Because that's exactly the misread Sarah Ferguson wants corrected. Now let's break the pacing into terrain analysis for retention psychology. The salon was a test, not a stage. The public loves monarchs of visibility, but insiders crown monarchs of narrative elasticity. Yachts were the liminal spaces where circle grading happened silently. You weren't being interviewed. You were being weighed. Like gold on scales that don't leave numismatic photos. People inside Soho aristocracy know that red carpets are for fame, private decks are for evaluation. Evaluation means you must demonstrate the following unspoken criteria. Social grace without broadcast. Brand elasticity without contradiction implosion. Circle selective adaptability without reputational fracture. Political temperature sensitivity without memos. Silence stewardship. Narrative latent potential. Storm survival probability. Strategic adjacency network expansion without intoxicated liability signatures early. That was the pattern recognition grading system. Meghan wasn't failing or shining. She was scoring in currency that never prints numbers. But the currency printed her later. Emotionally, this means something fascinating. You can't find the documents early, but you can find the gravity. And gravity leaves a trail even when paper doesn't. Sarah Ferguson says she recognized gravity patterns because she once lived in rooms where the public invented her ledger without access to scoring sheets. She knows what an evaluation salon looks like when it floats silently above ocean tide without cameras. She could smell when a name was being tested in a minimalist wind tunnel culture that predated official biography, centuries of narrative misinterpretation, where the absence of evidence eventually becomes evidence of absence from land-based institutional narrative containment for PR teams that discovered too late you were being staged socially. But there was still one grade no one has ever talked about publicly. Guest lists aren't attendance. They're ballots. Let's turn the camera on the psychology of the list itself. You think a guest list is who shows up. In this world, a guest list is who votes. Not with hands, with presence. At Soho aristocracy, the real power resides in the list you attend, the list you get invited back to, the list that stops inviting you, the list that wants you introduced, the list that wants you siloed. The list where someone laughs, then stops laughing after a piece moves on the board. The list where relevance is pelagic, silent, layered, politically advisory but not policy signed, socially evaluation heavy, personality tested, brand elastic, reputationally polled, and never protected by memos until funding flows upstream years later when monarchy or Hollywood auditors finally read the transcript publicly. This was the first ballot ecosystem Meghan entered. And it felt quiet, friendly, luxurious, but it was never neutral. Publicity is always downstream of elite perception parliaments. Now ask yourself this. How does someone become the subject of global royal exit narrative anthropology storms later, if not through shame-based scandal, but through narrative potential translation that gets forecasted by media composers who eventually claim they always knew the origin, but never had the syllabus until a witness like Sarah reveals she held the ledger mentally longer than anyone admitted? Because ballots disguised as parties eventually become narrative power economies. Soho House yacht culture wasn't a floating red carpet. It was a floating jury box of potential brand adaptability. Guests were jurors of cultural capital more potent than bloodline lineage PR messaging. They were unspoken ballots cast in social currency that eventually influenced the storytellers that tell stories that influence institutions, that influence publics, that influence politicians, that influence monarchy messaging that will arrive years too late to declare narrative authorship by official decree. It's not a club. It's a constitutional monarchy of curated speculation governance with no transcripts. But the transcripts exist socially. And Sarah Ferguson says she heard them in the silence. But one juror wasn't grading brand potential. One guest was grading the story's economics. This is where the twist hits harder than a title drop. Let's call him the unboastful grade holder. Not a monarch, not a photographer, not a journalist. A man whose relevance didn't hinge on visibility. He already possessed that in excess. His relevance hinged on narrative leverage qualification before institutional polling happened publicly downstream. He wasn't inside Soho's embassy to be charmed. He was inside Soho's embassy to early scan the potential that could socially bend the narrative velocity of any future public figure cameo silhouette that might displace institutional gravity later if redeployment into monarchy or Hollywood exit speech leagues eventually occurred. He was the one vote that could flip everything. But here's the cliffhanger route. He didn't flip it because Meghan scored badly. He flipped it because he saw something more profitable than scoring sheets: translation potential. The ability to recrown a silent internship deck era into wider institutional relatability monologue currency later with no contradictory implosion in brand semantics or story fidelity. Which leaves us at the chapter's final line. But the night wasn't over. The list wasn't finished voting. And one introduction had been held back in silence, because it wasn't a hello at all. It was a handover. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What's more powerful than who you know? Who claims to know you first? You've heard the phrase close personal friends tossed around like confetti at award shows, charity galas, and glossy interviews. But what happens when a phrase like that stops being decorative and becomes strategic architecture? What happens when a casual sentence quietly mutates into an ecosystem of leverage? Sarah Ferguson says that if you want to understand the trajectory, you have to stop looking at the yachts like ocean metaphors and start looking at them like phrase laboratories where stories get stress-tested, alliances get prototyped, and narrative ownership is rehearsed by people who already have more visibility than they could ever spend publicly. So let's pick this apart, slowly enough to feel the pressure build and fast enough to make you lean in. When gossip becomes contract gravity, this night wasn't a storm. It was humidity before the rain. A sentence drifting above oceans like mist, polite, quiet, and deceptively harmless. Yet inside influence aristocracies, phrases are not ornaments. They're prototypes, currency placeholders. A vocabulary exchange market operating 3 stories above the waves and 6 months ahead of any institutional announcement. This is the beat the media always fails to document. The moment a theory quietly becomes social capital. Meghan entered this era publicly as a working actress. Soho House entered this era privately as reputation refinery. The media entered this era later as myth composer without the sheet music. And Sarah Ferguson? She says she entered this era as the translator of circles that never published transcripts. Now, you might think the birth of narrative gravity needs a scandalous catalyst. Something loud, messy, indisputable. The Hollywood version of proof. The Westminster version of hearings. The Windsor version of proclamations. But Soho doesn't need loud. It needs consensus. So let me ask you this. How many moments in your life do you think were small, silent, or even laughed at? Until the laughter stopped, and you realized someone powerful had quietly taken note of your ability to bend the moment into future narrative leverage without breaking the story's fidelity? Consensus is the real signature here. Consensus is the invisible crown. When Soho consensus locks onto a person, a phrase, or a potential alliance, that moment starts traveling socially faster than land-based PR teams can engineer a response. It drifts quietly like gossip currency traded in minimalist embassies, where silence itself is not a denial, it's highway infrastructure. But what makes gossip different here? Glad you asked. Because retention likes the rare detail. In gossip ecosystems, land gossip spreads by proof. Title gossip spreads by memory. Soho gossip spreads by who remembers first. If you are introduced inside Soho joke-based circles, your intro is a voting ballot without memo publication. The grading criteria isn't moral. It's mechanical. Can your story elasticity survive redeployment later in media environments without contradictory implosion? Meghan did something very few people understand. She didn't fight gossip. She repurposed silence. Silence became a degree, a resume annex, a velvet-lined supply chain that eventually allowed her to exit institutional drainage narratives years later armed with the one thing the monarchy once used best, narrative authority. But the night Sarah is referring to wasn't about weapons. It was about the people who had them but weren't drawing them yet. And then one person claimed to know her better than consensus liked. The friendship the tabloids would have salivated over, 900 words. Now we walk into the piece de resistance of unphotographed introductions. Imagine this as a casting callback, except the role wasn't in a film. It was in a future narrative distribution superstructure. A newly relevant celebrity connector climbed aboard this floating salon not for relaxation, but for recognition. A man who didn't just facilitate introductions, he possessed proof of adjacency others never got signed first. In traditional Hollywood hierarchies, proof of adjacency is published in call sheets, press junkets, or pap-lensed exposures. Here, adjacency was social first recognized, but land first denied because the ocean voting room conceals transcripts better than journalists hide headlines in CNN lower third tickers. This friendship, rumored, calibrated quietly, but not documented by cameras, and instead documented mentally by ballots that mattered most inside circles that never testified until Sarah broke silence publicly. Why did it matter so much? Because unlike the other connectors, this person boasted about friendship category access potential. This person used the phrase close personal friends like a branding prototype crowbar. This person was certain the public would eventually learn his name, if the narrative timeline could be repurposed later by a witness like Fergie. This person didn't understand that when you push consensus inside Soho quiet ballot aristocracies, you become the lesson plan, not the student plan. Meghan herself later would do a lot of PR translation in public interviews. She would eventually appear next to royals at weddings, stadium benches, or Hollywood speeches about advocacy aesthetics. But this particular friendship? This was the person who tried to grade her first publicly in social currency, but did not realize the ocean halls of voting reserved special seat at the table for narrative students who bend brands tacitly before kingdoms publish memos years later. So let's talk psychology of introductions that change stakes. You think fame is visibility. In Soho, fame is ammunition you don't fire yet. Introductions are the powder. That night, the powder got lit by someone who didn't know silence was the real fuse. Another audience sting for you. Have you ever had a friend who didn't know they were actually the prototype for the lesson you needed to learn about narrative elasticity? Have you ever had someone who loudly believed they were the greater of your era, until empire-level silence politely took over the script and reminded them they were not presiding in jurisdiction that prints transcripts at all? That was exactly the danger here. Because when you believe you own the narrative of someone else's origin, a real voting room quietly corners you into becoming the narrative component public mythology battles deploy years later without you being the author of the story ever again. Now let's hit the aha moment without evidence, which I can safely phrase this way. This friendship was not glamorous because of who it included in 2016. It was glamorous because the media never got an invite, yet the circles that reacted to it later recognized the prototype socially heavier than any monarchy press team could grab PDF ownership for it all. Sarah Ferguson says the public would have canonized the close personal friends introduction differently had they understood the grading rubric. Introductions that boast implode the fastest. Introductions that brokers silently travel the farthest. Introductions that convert reputational elasticity into institutional debates later become legendary not because of the decks themselves, but because of what they incubated without memos. And on that deck, consensus clock was ticking, silently. But the real handover hadn't happened yet. The unspoken transfer of narrative jurisdiction. Now we arrive at the final emotional sting of this chapter before the next hook launches. All the introductions, laughter, ballots, adjacency consensus layers, and social internships were leading to an unspoken escalation. A moment where one destination silently replaced another, where one form of visibility refinery education concluded and the next began. Where a woman who was learning how to bend narratives without breaking became subject of competitions from connectors who did not understand the ocean circle system, valued adaptability silently, and weaponized protagonistic narrative authority publicly only years later, after Fergie survived to speak. This was the moment insiders say everything was being prepped for public mythology without testimony's evidence chain. This wasn't an intro. It was an offboarding document. Not the kind you print on land. The kind that changes the market. But the ocean wasn't done voting. The guest list still held one name in reserve. And when that introduction finally arrived, it wouldn't borrow visibility, it would issue it. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What if protocol was never something she married into, but something she studied like a second script? Because here's the twist. Before Meghan Markle ever walked through palace gates, shook hands on Commonwealth tours, or learned the micro-movements of royal optics, she was moving through a parallel system that functioned like a covert finishing school for influence. Polite, polished, strategic, and invisible to the general public. Not an institution that bestowed power, but one that measured who could wield it quietly later without narrative collapse. And the yachts, the rose-gold sunsets, the quiet hellos? Those were the lecture halls. Now let's connect the dots. The Windsor system didn't recognize her first, but Soho did. Look, every monarchy has rules. The ones they publish, and the ones everyone else has to decode through experience. The British monarchy is old, granite-built, oak-backed, bound by tradition, parliamentary intersections, state dinners, briefings, and centuries of myth. It operates on legacy permanence. Soho House operates on social anticipation. Here's the difference. Windsor says, your role is defined when the institution grants it. Soho says, we grant nothing, we evaluate everything. The monarchy sees influence as something to be managed. Soho sees influence as something to be mined for future leverage. And here's the paradox. Meghan would later publicly clash, or appear to clash, with the monarchy's communication tempo, its media translation reluctance, its procedural delays. Yet long before that, She immersed herself in a world that was basically a rapid cycle Westminster meets Hollywood meets ambition course delivered via friendship currency on decks. A system that tested if you could handle perceptions that travel faster than facts, broker introductions that don't use memos, protect brands without press teams, expand circles without fracture, translate elite access into mainstream relatability later. And the name Duchess of Yacht was the first exam headline the tabloids never sat in on. Sarah Ferguson recognized it because she once failed the monarchy's media tempo test herself, but passed